Okay, thank you, Steve. As we all know, Steve has a persuasive personality about him, and it comes as no surprise that my first conversation, which lasted 5 minutes 3 months ago, landed up me being here right now. And I think we'd all like to thank Jack again for a fantastic presentation that he did, something we didn't know. I didn't know anyway. As you've already guessed, my birthplace was all the way from Western Australia. I was in good company because the guy on the left-hand side, you probably recognise, yeah, he was born in the same town as me, where I grew up, which was Shrewsbury, right on the Welsh border. That little circle I put there is the north of the West Midlands, but it bordered North Wales. It's slap bang on the border. I'm sure that you would understand that in the mid-40s, there were a lot of airfields built in Great Britain or UK, and I'm told about 301 in all, most of which have been resumed now for housing estates, factories, motorways, whatever, gone back to farming. But one of them stands out quite a lot, and probably one you haven't heard of, which is RAF Shawbury. Anyone heard of it? Good. Yeah, 2 people, huh? I'm impressed. It's approximately 9 miles from Shrewsbury. On this map here, that's where Shrewsbury was. Shawbury was about 9 miles that way, which I used to cycle to and back in one day, 9 miles each. And just up here, I've highlighted another place called Slape, RAF Slape. And I'll talk about more of that later. That's been resumed or changed back to civil, and it's just used as now something like Murrayfield now. Later on, Shawbury, after it, first of all, Shawbury came to being in 1917, the year before the end of the First World War, and it was a flying establishment for the RFC, or Royal Flying Corps. Instead of just folding after the war, it's still going today, and it's one of the biggest, largest, and most impressive training airfields in Europe, maybe the world, and I'll show you a bit more of that later. And as Steve pointed out, a particular Lancaster named Ares, or he didn't point it out, but he should have done. You may not have heard about this, but Ares, which was named after the Zodiac constellation, was fitted out for research purposes and made many epic long-range flights around the globe with an 11-man crew testing navigation principles, the effect on human performance, engines and airframe, and especially in the polar regions. It was also used to identify the magnetic North Pole. And for those interested in these remarkable flights, you can get more information if you go onto the web, where everything is these days. The Ares flight of 1945, and it's called Air Force Part 1. That was the actual aeroplane that they modified to do all these investigations. So this is where it all began, and as you will observe, RAF Shawbury was attracted some noted figures. So, as I say, Shawbury was where it all started for me. And this was the first document ever given to me in the Air Training Corps at the time, when I was at the ripe old age of 14. What's so valuable about this was this bit here, that I was able to fly as a passenger in an RAF aircraft or a selected civil aircraft, as long as I had a parent's permission and the commanding officer's signature as well. So if you look at the date on that, that was the 10th of the 10th, 1960. It didn't take me long to put that into use. If you look at the top run, 21st of the 10th, 1960, 11 days after, I took my first flight in a Piston Provost. Anyone heard of them? No, Piston Provost? Well, in those days, that was the advanced trainer of choice in the RAF. And just along the top line there, you'll see what they did was a GCA, which is ground control approach. I flew for 1 hour with a master pilot Roland. Now, just to say, the Piston Provost T1, it just so happened, in my case, call sign was Tango. It's just one of those things. GCA, Ground Controlled Approach, was the forerunner of ILS as we know it today. And Master Pilot Roland is a rank that no longer exists. It faded out in the late 60s, and for whatever reasons, the RAF and the RAAF decided that all pilots had to be commissioned from that day on. See earlier. And as you can see, had some very notable figures at Shawbury. Obviously, that wasn't taken in 1960. And just to give you an idea, the aircraft in the background is a Juno, if you know that. And I'll talk more about that later. And as you can see, the Shawbury itself, it doesn't actually show you much there. That was just the sort of people who did their training there. It became that important. So, what I want to talk to you today is basically about the 3 aircraft I first stepped in when I was 14, courtesy of the Air Training Corps in my hometown, of course. And some of you have heard of the Piston Provost, Hunting Receiver Provost. That was the advanced trainer of the day. I'm sure that you've all heard of the Vampire. And this one down here, how many people have heard of that one? Yeah, fantastic. Well, this one here is had another aircraft which used to fly alongside it called a Valletta, which the civil version was the Viking. I'm sure you've heard of that. Yep. And this was an interesting aeroplane which I'll talk about in depth later. But back to this one. As you can see, this formation you see there, that I found this on YouTube. It was unbelievable. That was the actual plane I flew in at 14 years old in 21st of October 1960. Amazing that somebody actually has still got that. I mentioned RAF Slate earlier on, and it was about 5-6 miles away from Shawbury, and it was used for training air traffic controllers and also pilots in guided approaches into using radar and talk down procedures, which I'll speak more about later. And today it's been taken back, or it's been relinquished by the RAF and is now just a normal airfield, but it was extremely important up until even longer than when I was there in 1960. And you'll see the sort of thing that they used to do. I'll come to that a bit later. Right, what I was going to show you next is something about the Piston Provost, how people can get really fall in love with these planes, and to fall in love with them you need lots of money. And this next YouTube footage I found, which was interesting, it was about a pilot who actually was in the RAF and liked them so much, he went to America, became a salesman, and bought one. And there's only a few of them around the world now, and I think you'll find his commentary very interesting. I think the commentary there says it all. How many of us would get away with that today? There are a few specification differences to the one I flew in, and if you take a look at this diagram here, you notice the guy on the left has got his parachute on. Well, in 1960 the parachutes were a lot more bulkier, and that looks quite good compared to the one that we had to wear. But here you see him just about to get into the cockpit, which was very awkward. What they used to do in those days in 1960, if you notice down here, like a bucket type situation in the seat, they used to basically put the parachute in there, and you used to be able to get in there without the parachute on, and then just do it all up when you got in there. And even that was pretty awkward, because the straps, you had the 5-point seat belts and the parachutes, which were a lot bulky too. It was quite a procedure. Just looking at the cockpit above there, I've just made a couple of notes. This 10-channel VHS, I only made mention of that because later on, when I joined the RAF, I used to work on these type of things, and you just see the controllers there, but the actual main body, or the main part of the transmitter receiver, was housed in the fuselage behind the pilot. It's about as big as a big shoebox. So there's a couple of the specs about it that the guy was talking about, and I think it was pretty impressive when you think that the fact that its ceiling height was 22,500 feet, and for the day I thought that was quite remarkable. And you see at the bottom I've made a note that it retired in 1969, which is interesting because if you look at the next slide, this one, the one that came out about the same time as the Piston Provost was its brother, the Jet Provost. Both of them came into service fairly well at the same time. The Piston Provost sort of last days in '69, whereas the Jet Provost lasted a bit longer, as you can see. But it's remarkable about the two cockpit layouts. Obviously one's a jet, one's a prop, but they were quite similar. So, if you're looking for a Provost, I saw this online. I don't know if it's up for sale still, but if you've got a cool £50,000, it's yours. Okay, the next aircraft is probably more familiar to you. There were 3,500 made of these, and it was probably the trainer of choice for novice pilots, jet pilots that is. And I made a note in here, as long as you were under a certain height, because I noticed that most of the pilots who got into the seat in these things, there was about an inch or so between the top of the head and the canopy. So they were pretty tight fit. For me, this was a big kahuna, because you imagine my bragging rights at school at 14. Not only was it a jet, but it had a Martin Baker ejector seat as well. Now, at 14 years old, that was good bragging rights, I can tell you. But before I was allowed to step into this amazing machine, I had to undertake a 20-minute demo of how to extricate myself from the seat in the event I was rocketed out the top of it following some catastrophic event. And furthermore, the seat refusing to part company with me on descent. How do you fancy the chances? In a nutshell, there are fasteners on the side of the seat which following an ejection, the seat from the release as the seat falls away from, or is supposed to fall away from the occupant. First of all, it goes about 200 feet above the aeroplane. A drogue chute steadies the seat, and after it steadies it, and at a certain height, the seat parts company with the pilot, and at the same time pulls his ripcord so that he can have a nice descent to ground. That's how it's supposed to work. But what happens if the seat doesn't come apart from the pilot? That's where it gets a bit sticky, because you've got literally seconds in which to find a way to undo yourself, that's the seat belt, from the ejector seat, so that you come down the ground separate from the seat. Otherwise you'll end up as a big black hole. At a 14-year-old, we weren't thinking about that. The next slide is how it should work. As you can see, there's drogue sheets being deployed. The seat is steadied, although he's upside down. And at a certain altitude, bang, out comes the parachute. The seat falls away from the pilot, and there again, he falls to earth. Great if it works well, isn't it? 14, remember that. I think that says it all. The next bit, slide over, so the next bit of vision I was going to show you is the Vampire in its, as it was. It was a lovely aeroplane. But unfortunately, people lost sight of just how powerful it was. And one day in the UK, at a small get-together of aircraft, which usually has something like a Cessna 152, 172, they decided to invite a Vampire along. And the consequences were this. as when it was flying, a beautiful aeroplane of its day. And I think the RAAF had quite a few of them as trainers as well. So the bottom line is this. Do you think you got an invite back? There's the sort of specs of it. It was quite an impressive, once again, ceiling height of 40,000 feet, which wasn't too bad for the day. And seeing as it was made of plywood as well, and with a Goblin engine, it did very well. So I mentioned earlier about GCA. Some of you may know what GCA is, but it really was the forerunner of ILS as we know today, Instrument Landing System. And in 1960, at Shawbury, in conjunction with air traffic controllers at Slate, this airfield which is about 5 or 6 miles away, they used to practice these routines of letdowns in marginal conditions. And as you can see from the diagram here, they had the radar which used to scan left to right, top to bottom, whilst the aircraft was on the glide path or on approach to the actual airdrome. On the diagrams here, you can see that on the radar screen, the air traffic controller could make out whether the pilot was above or below the glide slope or left or right of it. And what he used to do is just correct or give a call out to the pilots and just tell him to adjust his rate of descent or whatever. And this is basically, this little video I've got here is the modern day version of how it would work.
On center line, on glide path. 1 mile. On center line, on glide path. Passing decision height. On center line, half a mile. Over touchdown.
And those first flights I did in the Provost, this is what they were doing all the time. And in the Vampires they did something called QGH, which basically was the same down. It was a talk down using direction finding gear and using the same airfield with much the same situation as that. So I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I was only 14, remember? But you can see if anyone's ILS qualified, IFR, you might relate to that. Okay, so the next aeroplane I want to talk about is really quite interesting to say the least. It's a big varsity, and it was called the Classroom of the Air. And it was basically modelled on the Lancaster, would you believe, the flight deck. And it accommodated a pilot, co-pilot, signaller, navigator, operator, bomb aimer, and observer. And in 1960, they still had quite a few of these around, and the particular flight that I went on was an astronavigation flight, and which was interesting in itself because, it had a radome on the top of the aircraft. If you have a look, just about there was like a plexiglass radome where the navigator used to get his star sightings at night. And the flight that I went on, about 6.5 hours, and they flew down the coast of England to the Scilly Isles. And there was a couple of questions I asked myself now when I look back. At the time I didn't care because I was 14 and I was on a night flight, and it's the first long distance flight I ever did. There's a couple of specs about it, just out of interest. There was only about 350 made, and the The last one, as you saw, was released from the factory in 1953, and I don't know of any of us flying today. There's one or two probably, but there wouldn't be many. So this is where I got a bit of a funny feeling about this flight. If you take a look at the distance between Shawbury, up here, in the Scilly Isles, down there, it's about 253 miles. Now the TAS for this aeroplane is about the same, or 239, as you can see there. So when you look back and say, well, the total flight time I had in my logbook was 6 hours 20 minutes, so how did that work out? If you double the distance, 2.5 hours at most. So he must have either had strong headwinds, no stars to navigate by, or I wasn't told the full story. That's probably the one. But I didn't care. The actual layout of where I was sitting in the aircraft at the time, this is the signaller's station. Signaller sat here, I was sitting there, and as you can see from this, the Morse key got a good workout over the flight. This particular radio is called 1154-55 AM HF, or amplitude modulated high frequency radio. Had very big valves inside it, I can tell you. And it was probably replaced a year or two later with another radio called an STR-18, but that's something for another time. That was the transmitter, which took a bit of tuning up, and that was the receiver there, quite big. On the side here, that's where all the Very pistols cartridges were kept. And behind this rack was where the navigator sat, and the actual radome was just up there, behind the rack itself. Right, and that's where the nav used to take his sightings on the astro navigation exercise. So basically, there's the actual specs for the plane, quite impressive for the day. Obviously radial engines, had quite a sizable carrying capacity, not so fast, and it had a very respectable range, 2,648 miles. And as I said, it was used as like a flying classroom. At Shawbury at the time, they had what they called the University Air Squadron, and basically were based on, they were trying to get university students in from the local university interested in flying or joining the RAF. So they used to give them a try before you buy situation, and if they came up to spec, they would try and encourage them in, and if they didn't, go your own way sort of thing. So back to RAF Shawbury. Today it's just it's an interesting situation because they use it both for RAF purposes and civil. They've got like a dual use of it. But I think when you see this next short video I've got, it'll blow you away with what's happened here. Now remember, this RAF station now is about 105 years old. It came into being in 1917. In 2022, it's now considered one of the most important training establishments in Europe. And I've just written a note to you, which I'll read from because it's worth saying. It uses the modern Airbus Juno HT helicopter, a Shaw Brothers Tucano jet turbine trainer, and the next generation, it trains the next generation of air traffic controllers, weapons controllers, identification officers, and flight operations personnel. The Air and Space Operations Specialists make it technically second to none as a world-class training facility in 2022, as you'll see from the short documentary made by the BBC.
These helicopters are being used to train the next generation of pilots who'll be flying Britain's military helicopters, and they belong to a really unusual school that you might not have heard of, the Defence Helicopter Flying School. Students here are benefiting from a £1.1 billion upgrade of the site and facilities. The school now boasts the largest fleet of Juno helicopters in the country. It has 29, along with 3 Jupiter aircraft. They're used to train the student pilots, including new graduate Flight Lieutenant Jamie Johnson.
So here you can see we've got the systems page, which is talking about the engines, what they're all doing, showing you the fuel levels and that sort of thing. This would usually have the maps loaded up, 50,000, quarter mil maps, all that sort of thing, any scale you like, and you can zoom right in, zoom right out, and you can basically tailor it to the mission that you're doing at the time.
With their glass cockpit technology and touchscreen avionics, the Juno and Jupiter leave the old aircraft with their dashboards of analogue dials in the dust.
I think being in the computer generation has definitely helped, because effectively they're an iPad with buttons around the edge. That's all they really are. So as soon as you get into your head into the idea of how the systems work together, there's really not too much difficulty, and they are actually designed to be really user-friendly. So it's a real step up.
Before getting airborne, students begin their training firmly on the ground, inside this state-of-the-art building, which houses the very latest in simulator technology. This is the only facility of its kind in the world. Each of these 4 vast domes holds one simulator, where the cockpit matches the one found in the Juno and the Jupiter aircraft.
If you get close to trees or if you crash this aircraft, your body reacts and you will sort of screw up your eyes and stuff. So it's certainly seducing enough to make you think that as you get close to ground, that you'll feel like you're in a real aircraft.
Motion cueing technology means you feel movement, even though the simulator itself is static.
That feels like we're climbing, and if we start rolling, it feels like we're rolling. Okay, and there you can feel the increase in vibration as we start to go around the corner, and then it levels out. So it's enough that if you close your eyes and a pilot is flying it, if you close your eyes, you would be able to tell probably what the aircraft was doing.
Once they've learned to fly, the students move on to the Command Tactics Trainer. It's also known as the Top Gun Room. This is where students who've already learnt to fly the aircraft learn to fight the aircraft. This is where they learn to fight the war.
Rather than just flying the aircraft around, they now have to start learning how to command the aircraft, command the resources within the aircraft, and also deal with other entities outside.
That's a vital part of the training. The Defence Helicopter Flying School is tri-service. When they leave here, the students go on to fly Chinook, Wildcat, Puma and Apache. The cockpit technology they find here now matches what they'll find in their frontline aircraft.
So we're able to use now far more conversion to role of the roles that people will do on the front line, including defensive aid suite emulators on board the aircraft. We can fit cameras for them to do EO and IR, so we can do the recce function that the Army Air Corps require as well. So we are able to do the basic stuff, but also to do the more advanced techniques that require, and that seamless transition to the front line.
The school only began operating its new facilities last April, and already its helicopters spend around 100 hours a day in the air, making sure the aircrews of the future have the perfect grounding for a career spent in the skies.
Pretty impressive, don't you think? So, you've come a long way from that. When you think about it, you know, the guys who used to fly these things, they probably thought they were pretty specky as well. You know, that was in 1917 when they were flying those. That's where they started. And the last video you just saw is where they are today. So you see they've been very progressive. So, looking back, where I started, in the ATC, I started there in 1960. And I've just found this on their webpage today, so they're still going. And not only are they still going, but they've been very progressive. For instance, when I was there, it was a men-only club. But now, as you can see, fully integrated. And the CEO there is Flight Lieutenant Elizabeth Holmes, who looks like she's done very well. And just one little thing I just wanted to show you, which they have a fantastic historical database that goes back to the time they first started in 1941. And year by year, they've got it catalogued every year as what they achieved. The only reason I'm showing this one is if you notice here, I didn't even know that existed. So I was quite chuffed when I saw that. As I say, I didn't notice it till a couple of days ago when I was looking through, doing some research, and yeah, it goes from 1941 up to the modern day. So that was the start of where I went to in life, and my next venture, as it were, was to join the RAF in avionics, and these are the sort of aeroplanes I was working on, and basically all of them, probably with the exception of maybe that one, now confined to museums and flying in places, perhaps that one up there too. This one came to an abrupt halt, as we all know, but all deserve their place in history. They've all done magnificent jobs when you think about it. So, that's it from me, and if you have any questions, please fire away.